so we can start the game. Go ahead. Let's clear the field so we can start the game.
Welcome to Clear the Field, a podcast about when baseball goes sideways. I'm Ted Walker, co-host of the podcast Take Note. I'm here with Paul Jackson, the historian, writer, and storyteller behind Project 318, the newsletter on Substack. In the newsletter and here on Clear the Field, Paul delves into the dustbins of history to pull out the pop caps of knowledge to wing in our general direction. In this episode, the first of a two-part story about a Philadelphia forfeit that pushed a three-man umpiring crew to the brink of sanity. In part one, a questionable call riles up the Phillies, and the crowd grabs whatever is at hand to join the mayhem.
Ted, you know I've spent a lot of time exploring baseball's diciest forfeits. And I can tell you that one clear risk factor in a forfeit is that it's the second game of a doubleheader. Maybe this is why Let's Play 2 has kind of fallen out of favor today. It gets even dodgier when the home team is getting blown out in that second game. The fans are getting bored, right? They're watching their team lose and looking for other ways to entertain themselves. And by the end of that second game in a doubleheader, there's twice as much trash laying around.
AKA ammunition, and I feel like the second game of a doubleheader is like the last connecting flight on the family vacation. You held it together for the first flight, but the second, from Nashville to Houston, not that I'm speaking from personal experience anyway.
It's also like the vacation that went on a little bit too long. At the beginning, you're like, this looks great. We're going to do 2 baseball games back to back. But at some point, reality intrudes. So those are the conditions for this story. In Philadelphia, the events are going to take place primarily on August 21st, 1949, at Shibe Park, a ballpark OG at the intersection of Lehigh Avenue and 21st Street. This is the ancestral seat of the Philadelphia Athletics, but Shibe was also home to the Phillies between 1938 and 1970, and this particular debacle goes entirely to the National League. So talking about the Phillies. And by 1949, Shibe could hold approximately 30,000 fans, but capacity was rarely a problem there. The 1930s and 1940s were pretty lean times for Philadelphia baseball. The Athletics were in pretty bad financial straits and would soon be abducted to Kansas City. And the Phillies were so historically bad that a few years earlier, a new ownership group had decided to try and reboot the team down to a new nickname and see if anybody noticed. So since 1944, the team had been rebranded as the Blue Jays. The name was chosen from a fan write-in contest, but the team never really fully committed to this change. In 1944 and 1945, a Blue Jay patch was added to the uniform shoulders, creating a pretty cool historical artifact. But Phillies is still written in script across the chest.
This has a real midlife crisis vibe to it. Like you buy a blue convertible, start combing the hair over a little more aggressively. It's not an inspired effort.
It's a whole new me. But the team didn't commit. They gave up on this experiment in January of 1950. They dropped the name and they changed the navy blue uniform motif that they were wearing at the time to a bright red that I think we'd all recognize today as a classic Philadelphia Phillies color style. So we're in the final year of this pseudo life. So these are still technically sort of the Jays, the Phillies. They're turning things around, though. For the first time in 16 years, the Phillies were going to finish with a winning record. But over 500 didn't mean much because there were a couple of heavy hitters, the Brooklyn Dodgers and the St. Louis Cardinals, dominating every other team in the league. But some pieces are falling into place in Philadelphia. They've got Jim Constanti, one of the sport's first closers, if not in name. They have pitcher Robin Roberts, left fielder Del Ennis, and a 22-year-old center fielder that features in this story, Richie Ashburn, who debuted as an all-star in 1948, earned some serious Rookie of the Year consideration and a few MVP votes. So with Ashburn and a team of young whiz kids, as they were called, the Phillies are soon going to shock the baseball world and return to the postseason. But the promise of 1949, the year of this story, actually ended in mid-June when one of Philadelphia's heavy hitters, first baseman Eddie Waitkus, was lured into a Chicago hotel room and shot by an obsessed female fan. It was one of the earliest publicized examples of celebrity stalking in American history. Waitkus had been hitting .306 with 27 RBI and 47 runs scored at the time of his shooting. He survived, but didn't make it back until 1950. And in August, Philadelphia shortstop Granville Hamner, whose nickname was Granny, so Granny Hamner.
Thank you.
Yep. Said to a reporter, "If Eddie Waitkus hadn't been shot, I think you might have had a 3-club race. We were 3 games out when we lost him. It was a terrible blow." So without Waitkus, the rebuild kind of sputtered and the Phillies would have to wait until next year. But there was still plenty of baseball to be played, and that August, the New York Giants were just as stuck in the middle of the National League with nothing left to do but battle for that sweet, sweet third-place money. This mid-card matchup with the Phillies drew 19,000 fans to Shibe Park on August 21st. The crowd came loaded with packed lunches and cold beverages to survive the summertime doubleheader. Now, the drinks, I should say, would generally have been the non-alcoholic variety, since at this point in time, there was actually no alcohol allowed inside Shibe Park. Philadelphia has a much heavier history of so-called blue laws and restrictions on things like whether a game can be played at all and what can be consumed than a lot of other American cities. So at this point in history, no alcohol inside the park. It's a hot August day, though, so that means a lot of soda, which was called pop in this region of the country during this period, was the drink of choice. Ted, a little sidebar here, but I struggled as I was writing this. Where are we in 2026 as a society? Where are we with pop versus soda? I kind of feel like both names are on the outs, but I don't really know what's coming in.
Well, I like that you think that I know, but I some of us remember the joy of meeting young people from other parts of the country at that time in our lives, and the amazement of learning that they use different words for things than we do, and soda and pop was at the forefront of that experience. All I hear or say these days are brand names. I will throw in could I have a fountain soda or a fountain drink when I'm conveying that I'd like an empty cup to go use the custom machine in the corner with its 84 million possible combinations. This is my long way of saying I have no idea where we are with this question, Paul.
Well, I think, Ted, what you're saying is that's where we are. I think it's become very amorphous. But at the time, the nomenclature was pop. Either way, no alcohol. The Athletics and the Phillies may have been leaders in baseball temperance, but they were lagging behind the trends in some other areas. For instance, Shibe was one of the last ballparks in the majors where glass bottles were permitted, but this would be changing pretty soon.
And it's these kind of teases from you, Paul, that keep me going in these trying, difficult times of ours.
Oh, foreshadowing is our friend. The umpires feature heavily in this story, so let's talk about them for a minute. In 1949, regular season games were typically handled by a three-man umpire crew, one behind home plate and one standing on each foul line. Typically, there would be some movement depending on what was happening, but they were the third base umpire and the first base umpire. The umpire in charge for this game was Al Barlick, a 9-year veteran who had become widely respected around the National League. Lee Ballenfant was at third base, and he and Barlick had been working together for all of those 9 years that Barlick had been in the majors. And Ballenfant said of his crewmate, "Barlick was the best I ever saw, a natural-born umpire. Everything he did on the ball field was natural. He had a knack for it. Everything was easy for him. And he had good control. Nobody ran over him." Barlick was also known for his vocal stylings. He had a deep bass voice that turned ball and strike calls into little mini opera pieces. And here's how a writer in 1951 described it.
Barlick dismisses a ball with a disdainful baul and with, not exactly sure how to pronounce BAUW-W-W. You get the idea. And with a strike, it's a Hollywood production. He turns an abrupt right face, throws out his right arm as if he were stabbing at a vanishing cafeteria bun, and howls, "Stroke!" in the face of this awesome suffering. Even the batter, who didn't swing, feels a bit better.
You did some good sight readings there. That is what is transcribed, but we do not have or I did not find audio of Barlick's calls.
I'm a method actor.
That's all you could do. I liked reading that the crowds would often pick up Barlick's mannerisms by the seventh inning or so, and so he often finished these games with like a choir of impressionists behind him. So we've talked about the art aspect of umpiring before, and I think Al Barlick might represent the sort of height of this idea.
If it wasn't baseball umpiring, it was going to be community theater.
That's right. Now, Lee Ballenfant was a smaller man, and he had a much more visual style. And here's a snippet on Ballenfant from that same 1951 piece.
Lee's particular forte is the gesture of the hand as he calls a strike. He does it as if he were playing yo-yo.
The third umpire of the day, George Barr. Oh, yes, we're on. Yeah, you can do this.
You can see it on video. I can do a yo-yo.
That's why we're doing this.
As if I were playing yo-yo.
Maybe we'll add a video of someone playing yo-yo. So the third umpire, George Barr, had been on the field since 1931. It might be cliche when you say someone wrote the book on a subject, but I'm using it here because George Barr opened the first umpire training school in 1935, and he published a book called Baseball Umpiring in 1952. It was the first professional training manual for umpires, and Barr actually ended up retiring at the end of 1949, and the events of this story probably helped him make up his mind to take that life change. Each of these three umpires had called a Hall of Fame wing's worth of baseball in their careers. But in the middle of this 1949 season, they were mostly famous for what they had done to poor Andy Pafko in Chicago. So flashback, it's April 30th. The same umpire crew is working a game at Chicago's Wrigley Field that ends in some controversy. In the top of the ninth inning, the Cubs are leading 3-2, and there's 2 outs. St. Louis has a runner on first when the Cardinals' first baseman, Glenn Nelson, smacks a line drive into left center field. The Cubs center fielder is Andy Pafko, and he'd been shaded the wrong way, but he races to his right, and at the last minute manages a stabbing backhand catch just a few inches from the ground. It's an all or nothing performance, and he goes sprawling, but he's got the ball inside his glove. So watching all this from second base, he's moved up the line, Barlick, or away from the line. Al Barlick spreads his hand, palms down, no catch. He believes that the ball had touched the ground before Pafko gathered it up, making it a trap. But Pafko didn't see that call from the umpire because he was still mid-somersault. And in his mind, he'd just made the final out of the game. So he sits up, he's holding the glove over his head in triumph. And meanwhile, the Cardinals' third base coach is waving like crazy, telling the runner and Nelson to keep going. And Pafko said a few days later, I caught the ball. The game's over. We've won 3-2. I'm feeling dizzy, but good. Then somebody yells, throw the ball, throw the ball. What do I want to throw the ball for? I caught it. It's mine. I look in and everybody's running. So I jump up and show them the ball, but they keep running and yelling, throw the balls. So I throw the ball. Too late. Pafko ran in to argue with Barlick. He kept the ball in his glove as if this proved that he had made a clean catch. Only when he reached the infield did he realize that this evidence was still actually in play. And he fired a throw home, but it bounced off of Glenn Nelson's shoulder, and Nelson slides in with a 2-run inside the park home run that gives St. Louis the lead.
Now, how in the world does has a gaffed play like that, full of delusion and error, not become a Pafko? As in, I'm thinking, well, Kyle Tucker Pafko'd another one tonight.
Well, it's interesting because I think the prevailing sense at the time is sort of supporting Pafko and believing him in a situation where, as a third party reading about all this in the newspapers or listening to it on the radio, it's 50-50, right? I have no real, but he was generally seen as the wrong party. So we might say that
a tragic figure. Almost.
Yeah, we might say, that he really Barlicked that one.
In this day and age of instant replay, I'm so cynical about believing what even a participant in the play felt happen. It has almost no bearing. To me, the Pafko would almost be continuing to argue the play as the players round the bases.
Sure,
that to me is more of a gaffe than the actual.
The Pafko. I gotcha.
There we go.
Gotcha. So by now, the Cubs manager and the bench mob have joined Pafko in an argument with bellowing Al, who had, with one wave of his hands, taken Pafko from being a game winner to a goat.
The old kind of the goat, not the new kind of goat.
Isn't it funny how that term has totally flipped?
Indeed.
Well, Barlick wasn't budging, and appeals to Ballenfant and Barr, the other umpires, went nowhere. The game was delayed for 10 minutes while the crowd threw their seat cushions, confetti, and a medley of fruit and vegetables on the field. But the fans, this was just a one-off game. The fans eventually ran out of leftovers and watched the Cubs go quietly in the bottom of the ninth. So the day after the controversial ending, someone actually made Pafko and Nelson pose for a photo where Pafko is showing Nelson exactly where in his glove he'd caught what was ruled a 2-run homer. And it seems very awkward the way that the press would say, they would almost pose people. It's like, I want you here and I want you here. You look at this and you put this. It's like the players were these mannequins to kind of help tell the story in the pictures for the newspaper. Both men look a little uncomfortable. 3 days later, now the Cubs were in Boston and they were still talking about it with the Braves players and the press. They said it was an outrageous call by Barlick. They alleged that he failed to hustle, to get a good view, that he made the call too quickly, and that he failed to ask his colleagues for a second opinion. And we're just talking about replay, right? But in those days, a second opinion was the closest thing you got to replay. And certainly the other umpires were inclined to give their colleague the benefit of the doubt. but Barlick apparently didn't even check.
Well, the request for a second opinion is still happily deployed copiously in many a youth baseball game these days, with often comic results.
Now, how many umpires in that situation?
Usually two.
Two, okay.
And the one of the few ways a youth baseball manager can influence a call is to request that the umpire that he believes to be in error ask for the opinion of the other umpire, and then they get together and they talk and they make gesticulations, and then either they keep the call or, oh, God forbid, they reverse the call. Then it's just a waterfall of emotions.
Just as effective today, I'm sure. So Chicago outfielder Harry Walker was quoted complaining about the disputed trap call and making these comments that the Cubs were no doubt talking about all over the league. But I thought this was really interesting given some of that description of Barlick and his umpiring style that we talked about earlier. And the quote from Walker was, the umpires are so busy making all those fancy motions of theirs that they don't see the plays anymore. Whoa, so kind of taking a shot at the artistic
getting
license.
Barlick right where it hurts on that one.
So now we go back to August, and it's the day of the doubleheader, and things begin nicely for Philadelphia fans. They had their ace, Ken Heinzelman, who was dominant in the opener. He pitched a 5-hit shutout, and the offense tacked on a run here and there, and the result was a 4-0 Phillies victory in just over 2 hours. It was the Phillies' 5th straight win. There was a little bit of evidence early on in the day that the crowd was lively. The Giants pitcher, Sheldon Jones, at one point threw an up and inside pitch to the Phillies catcher, Andy Seminick, hitting him on the cheek. Seminick was only grazed, but he was visibly angry with Jones, and the fans took his lead and reportedly acted up vocally. The Giants had lost 5 straight, a stretch that resulted in the trade of all-star first baseman Johnny Mize to the rival Yankees. With Mize gone, a fill-in cast was now responsible for the Giants at first base. And in the second game, a part-time infielder and part of this crew, a guy named Joe LaFata, got the job at first base. Now, New York's odds overall were going to be better in the second game because they were going to face a big-name fill-in guy. So Philadelphia was pitching Linwood Rowe, who was better known as Schoolboy Rowe. He had been a pitching force in the late 1930s, helping the Detroit Tigers win a World Series, but his glory days were long over by this point. Now Rowe was 39. He was mostly used for mop-up work. He only made 6 starts for Philadelphia in 1949, but this happened to be one of those 6 starts. So the Phillies begin the scoring with solo home runs in the 3rd and the 5th innings, and Rowe gave up only 2 hits in that same span of time. But the Giants wore him down. They tied the score 2-2 in the 7th after a wild pitch and an error. New York pulled ahead with another run in the 8th, but Rowe was still out there pitching in the top of the 9th when the Giants threatened to add on again. The leadoff batter, Willard Marshall, singled and broke for second. He reached third base when the ball got away from the Giants as they tried to cut him down. Rowe got the next batter to strike out, and that brought up Joe LaFata in a moment where New York fans would much have preferred Johnny Mize. But LaFata showed those doubters by hitting a low line drive into center field, and out there, Richie Ashburn raced in to catch it. And he was already thinking about that throw he would need to make to keep Marshall from tagging up at third. But Ashburn stumbled at the very last second, making a somersault on the grass just as he appeared to catch the ball no more than 8 inches off the ground, just above his shoes. And Ted, does any of this sound familiar?
Let's hope he doesn't pull a Pafko.
Perfect. Meanwhile, umpire George Barr was racing towards second base to be in a position to make a call. The umpires would get a dedicated second base official in just a few more years, but in 1949, the line umpires still had to cover the middle of the park between them. Ashburn's chase had taken him away from Barr, closer to left field, where Lee Ballanfant would have been the one to make the call. Ballanfant maybe would have had a better look at it, but Barr was apparently determined to do the honors because the play had begun on his side of the park. Ashburn popped to his feet. The white ball is peeking out of the glove hand, and George Barr threw his hands away from his body, palms down. It was another trap. Marshall scurried home and extended the Giants' lead 4-2. Seeing Barr's ruling, Ashburn threw his glove on the ground in frustration and raced in, following that Pafko track, to have a word with the umpire. And Granny Hamner, the shortstop, joined him, and he said, Richie came in screaming. He said he made the catch. I say he made the catch. Everybody on the Phils says he made the catch. Barr still said no. And that was true. Barr said, Ashburn never caught that ball. Of course, that's the way I saw it. It's a matter of judgment. I guess I'm entitled to my decision.
I do feel like people use the phrase "I guess" more aggressively in the olden days. Nowadays, I'd say "I guess." Sounds like he's "I guess I'm entitled." Like, boom.
I think guess became think somewhere along the way. It's clearly the implication. Schoolboy Rowe and the Phillies manager, Eddie Sawyer, now joined the argument. Rowe added a wrinkle because he said he'd been watching Lee Ballanfant on the other side of the park, and he saw Ballanfant actually signal a fair catch. So you might have had two different umpires making calls on this particular play. But Barr made one more forceful dismissal of these arguments, and then he turned his back on this whole crowd of Phillies, 6 players and a manager. And Hamner said, well, everybody screamed one more time, and then we gave up. Once again, the fans in the seats were eager to follow the Phillies' emotional cues, but this time they really revolted. It started in left field and soon spread around the outfield bleachers and through the grandstands. Boos and hisses and people throwing everything loose. Seconds after Barr's ruling, the field was unplayable with debris. One account said a number of fans, quote, left the stands and went out onto the playing field, but mostly people let their trash do the talking. Hamner said that's when the pop bottles and other stuff began flying. On their way back to the outfield, Del Ennis and Richie were almost hit. Under this friendly fire, Ashburn and Ennis retreated to the line where the infield and the outfield met. The infielders drew closer to the pitcher's mound, and the 3 umpires were standing ominously consulting their pocket watches. The groundskeepers, who were shirtless and appeared to be very fit, dodged more trash as they tried to clear the park. The crowd kept at it. One writer said they littered the field with glassware, tin cans, assorted fruits and vegetables, all by way of offering on-the-spot criticism of the wisdom, judgment, vision, and ancestry of umpire George Barr. When it became clear that this was a full-on mass tantrum, the players made their way into the dugouts. Al Barlick called out to Eddie Sawyer, the Philadelphia manager, and warned him a forfeit was coming. But Sawyer just held up his hands. What can I do? The public address announcer made a warning, announcing that the game would be lost if the fans did not cease. The message was booed down, but the fans did stop throwing stuff. The park attendants cleaning up the debris were actually joined by a few good-hearted players from the Phillies bullpen, and the bleacher crowd let them work together to clear the field. After about 10 minutes, Barlick and the other umpires motioned for the game to resume. Schoolboy Rowe came back out to the mound and warmed up. The next Giants batter, Bill Rigney, stepped to the plate. And the umpires finally left the safety of the center of the diamond and resumed their positions on the lines much closer to those low grandstand walls. Their targets were now in range, and that wily Philadelphia crowd prepared to spring a trap of its own.
Stay tuned for part 2, when the toughest fans in the world deploy their beverages of choice, or the containers at least, to make life even tougher for our 3-man crew of Ballin, Fent, Barlick, and Bar. Clear the Field is produced by me, Ted Walker, based on research and original nonfiction writing by him, Paul Jackson. You can support the podcast in a few ways. Leave us a review and a rating on your podcatcher of choice. Really helps boost the signal for what we're doing here. If there's a baseball fan in your life that just can't get enough of these stories, send it to them. Send it in an email. I find that's still a pretty valid form of communication these days. Finally, Paul launched a voluntary subscription option via the Substack newsletter Project 318. That is your opportunity to support the library of absolutely free content and storytelling that he has put out into the world with such diligence and skill, and it's your chance to support it. So hop on over there. Finally, we'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment on Substack or send us an email at clearthefieldpod@gmail.com. Find more from me at takenote.space, and many more stories just like this on Paul's Substack. Search Project 3.18 wherever you like to search for stuff, and thank you for listening.